99% of you are not subscribed to the channel. At 1000 subscribers I will post a series of special stories. Subscribe now. The cold wind blew hard over Titan, shaking the windows of Jake Harrow's old workshop. It was always freezing here, no matter the time of year. The moon's dim, orange sky made everything feel like it was always dusk. In the distance, large seas of methane, once useful to human colonists, now lay empty and lifeless. Jake wiped grease off his hands, watching his breath in the chilly air. He had just finished fixing the last mining robot, but even as he completed the job, he felt a deep emptiness. There wasn't much left to fix on Titan. Humanity had been in decline for years since the war with the Trill, the aliens who had easily conquered Earth. Now, the few humans left lived under the strict control of these alien rulers. Titan, once a bustling colony on the edge of the solar system, had become a forgotten place. Its people were mostly slaves, and the colony was falling apart. Jake, the last real mechanic, was responsible for keeping things running. He looked at the large, rusted submarine in the corner of his workshop. Called Leviathan, it had been a relic from Earth's Navy, never used in the war. Jake had found it in a junkyard years ago, buried under debris like the rest of human history. He had spent hours fixing it, dreaming of what it might have been like to command it in battle. Jake wasn't a soldier, but something about the Leviathan gave him hope. Even though others had given up on old war machines, he hadn't. There was something about the design that inspired him, even as aliens ruled over them. But hope was dangerous on Titan. As if to remind him, the door to his workshop opened with a sharp hiss. Jake stiffened when he saw who entered. Trill soldiers. They were tall, thin creatures with long limbs and smooth, shining skin. Their faces were hidden by living helmets, part of the advanced technology that made them so powerful in battle. The Trill weren't there for repairs, they never were. They had come for entertainment. The human mechanic, one of them sneered through a translator, still playing with your old toys, I see. Jake stood tall, his hands still dirty from fixing the robot, and stared back at the alien soldier. He didn't speak, knowing it would only encourage more ridicule. The Trill enjoyed belittling humans, especially those like Jake who clung to their old ways. In their eyes, everything human was obsolete, primitive technology, crude weapons, and worse, a broken spirit. The leader of the group, who wore a particularly ornate helmet, stepped closer to the Leviathan, eyeing it with a mix of amusement and disdain. Is this your masterpiece? He asked, tapping a clawed finger against the submarine's hull, which let out a dull metallic sound. A war machine? How quaint. The other soldiers chuckled, their voices a mixture. The cold wind blew hard over Titan, shaking the windows of Jake Harrow's old workshop. It was always freezing here, no matter the time of year. The moon's dim, orange sky made everything feel like it was always dusk. In the distance, large seas of methane, once useful to human colonists, now lay empty and lifeless. Jake wiped grease off his hands, watching his breath in the chilly air. He had just finished fixing the last mining robot, but even as he completed the job, he felt a deep emptiness. There wasn't much left to fix on Titan. Humanity had been in decline for years since the war with the Trill, the aliens who had easily conquered Earth. Now, the few humans left lived under the strict control of these alien rulers. Titan, once a bustling colony on the edge of the solar system, had become a forgotten place. Its people were mostly slaves, and the colony was falling apart. Jake, the last real mechanic, was responsible for keeping things running. He looked at the large, rusted submarine in the corner of his workshop. Called Leviathan, it had been a relic from Earth's Navy, never used in the war. Jake had found it in a junkyard years ago, buried under debris like the rest of human history. He had spent hours fixing it, dreaming of what it might have been like to command it in battle. Jake wasn't a soldier, but something about the Leviathan gave him hope. Even though others had given up on old war machines, he hadn't. There was something about the design that inspired him, even as aliens ruled over them. But hope was dangerous on Titan. As if to remind him, the door to his workshop opened with a sharp hiss. Jake stiffened when he saw who entered. Trill soldiers. They were tall, thin creatures with long limbs and smooth, shining skin. Their faces were hidden by living helmets, part of the advanced technology that made them so powerful in battle. The Trill weren't there for repairs, they never were. They had come for entertainment. The human mechanic, one of them sneered through a translator, still playing with your old toys, I see. Jake stood tall, his hands still dirty from fixing the robot, and stared back at the alien soldier. He didn't speak, knowing it would only encourage more ridicule. The Trill enjoyed belittling humans, especially those like Jake who clung to their old ways. In their eyes, everything human was obsolete, primitive technology, crude weapons, and worse, a broken spirit. The leader of the group, who wore a particularly ornate helmet, stepped closer to the Leviathan, eyeing it with a mix of amusement and disdain. Is this your masterpiece? He asked, tapping a clawed finger against the submarine's hull, which let out a dull metallic sound. A war machine? How quaint. The other soldiers chuckled, their voices a mixture of hissing and clicking. Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his head down, focusing on a wrench in his hands. The Leviathan was more than a mere relic to him. It was a reminder of a time when humanity hadn't yet been ground beneath the boots of an alien empire, but the Trill didn't understand that. To them it was just another symbol of human failure. You know, the leader continued, circling the submarine. I heard that these old earthly war vessels couldn't even fight properly in space. The humans thought they could protect their oceans with them, but what good are oceans when your entire planet is burning? The laughter grew louder, and Jake felt his knuckles turn white as he gripped the wrench tighter. They didn't know what this submarine could do. They didn't know how much work he had put into restoring it. To them, it was a piece of junk, just another human relic left to rot like the rest of his race. One of the soldiers kicked a nearby toolbox, sending its contents scattering across the floor. Look at this place, he said, a museum of failures. Jake's patience snapped. Get out, he said, his voice low but firm. The laughter stopped abruptly. The lead Trill turned toward him, his eyes narrowing behind the organic visor. What did you say? Human, I said. Get out, Jake repeated louder. This time he stepped toward them, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't fight them, not physically, but he was tired of being humiliated in his own workshop. For a moment, the Trill seemed taken aback by the defiance. Then the leader laughed again, but this time it was a cold, menacing sound. He took a step toward Jake, towering over him. You should remember your place, mechanic. You may keep this pile of scrap, but you're still nothing more than a worm beneath our feet. Jake didn't back down. He stared up at the alien, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. The Trill leader sneered and motioned for his soldiers to leave. As they exited, the leader glanced back at the Leviathan one last time. Fix it up if you want, human, but no matter what you do, it will never be enough to stand against us. The door slid shut behind them with a hiss, leaving Jake alone in the workshop, surrounded by silence. His pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the door. For years he had swallowed his pride, playing along with their mockery, focusing on his work, hoping to stay out of the Trillies' way. But now the fire inside him was too strong to ignore. He turned back to the Leviathan, his gaze hardening. The Trill thought human technology was worthless. They thought Jake was just as useless as the old submarine, but he knew better. They had laughed at him and the machine, but he was determined to prove them wrong. In the dim light of his workshop, Jake climbed into the Leviathan, his hands shaking with excitement. Over the years, he had made repairs, finding parts from the ruins of Earth's technology. Now, it was time to finish what he started. He wasn't a soldier or a hero, but he was a mechanic, and he was going to make this old war machine work again. Days on Titan were long, with the constant orange haze of the thick atmosphere giving the land a gloomy look. Jake stood in the shadow of the Leviathan, his hands deep inside the submarine's control systems. His fingers moved fast, fixing circuits, replacing rusty parts, and running checks on the old Earth Navy software that powered the machine. The Leviathan had once been a top-level war vessel, but it was scrapped before it could show its full power. Now it was Jake's only hope. He didn't have time to waste. The Trill's mocking words still echoed in his mind, but that wasn't what motivated him. It was the way the alien soldiers looked at him, as if he and all humans were worth nothing. He could feel the weight of centuries of struggle pressing down on him, and the burden was too much to bear. He wasn't just fixing an old submarine, he was reaming something that had been stolen dignity. He spent hours working on the propulsion system, which had been modified to function both underwater and in space, a rare feature even among Earth's most advanced military vehicles. The twin-ion thrusters were rusted beyond recognition when he first found the Leviathan, but after years of scringy-ass black market trade and old scrapyards, he had found replacement parts. Now they hummed softly as he tested the engine systems, the low thrum of power sending a shiver of excitement through him. The workshop was a cluttered mess of discarded tools, spare parts, and half-repaired mining equipment, but in the center of it all, the Leviathan stood like a sleeping giant. Its black, sleek hull, once marred with dents and rust, had been painstaking restored. The war submarine's exterior gleamed under the artificial lights, revealing the craftsmanship of a bygone era. Jake stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow as he admired the progress. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was close. As night fell and Titan's freezing temperatures began to creep in, Jake returned to the cockpit. The submarine's interior was a maze of old control panels, screens, and manual levers. Earth's military had built the Leviathan with redundancy in mind. Every system had a backup, and the vessel was designed to keep fighting even under the worst conditions. Jake had spent years learning how to operate it, studying old military manuals and cobbling together training programs from what little data survived the war. He slid into the pilot seat, the cold leather creaking under his weight. His fingers hovered over the controls for a moment before he took a deep breath and began the startup sequence. The Leviathan groaned to life, its systems flickering on as power surged through its circuits. The reactor core, an experimental fusion device meant to power the submarine for decades, rumbled deep within the vessel, coming online with a low hum. Jake watched as the control panels lit up one by one, showing diagnostic readouts and system statuses. The reactor was stable, the thrusters were working, and the weapons, shields, and targeting systems were all online. Jake couldn't believe it. After years of scavenging and repairing, the Leviathan was finally back in action. He sat back in the pilot seat, feeling both relief and excitement, but he knew this was just the start. The moment he turned on the Leviathan, the Trill would detect the power surge. They had surveillance systems all over Titan, watching for any big energy use to make sure humans couldn't rebel. Jake had thought about this problem for years and prepared for it. He had cleverly used the colony's broken-down infrastructure to his advantage. He spent months rerouting power through decoys, making it look like he was doing normal repairs on mining equipment and the failing power grid. The Trill might notice the extra energy, but by the time they figured out where it came from, it would be too late. Still, Jake felt nervous as he prepared for the next step. He climbed out of the cockpit and went to the lower levels of the submarine, where the torpedo tubes and weapon systems were. The Leviathan had been designed as a powerful war machine, able to fight both underwater and in space. Its main weapons were plasma torpedoes, which could destroy alien ships in seconds. Jake had reloaded the torpedo bays with the last few plasma warheads he could find from Earth's old stockpiles. It wasn't a full load, but it was enough for his plan. He worked carefully, making sure everything was working perfectly. The torpedoes slid smoothly into their launch tubes, and the targeting systems came online without any issues. He had even repaired the cloaking device, a special piece of Earth technology that made the Leviathan invisible to most alien sensors. It wasn't perfect since the cloak used a lot of power, but it would give him the element of surprise. Jay wiped his hands on his coveralls as he stood back surveying his work. The Leviathan was ready for battle, but was he? A small part of him doubted it. He was a mechanic, not a soldier. He had never fired a weapon in anger, never fought in the war that had decimated humanity, but he didn't have a choice now. If he do something, the Trill would continue to grind humanity into the dust until nothing was left but a few scattered outposts forgotten by the galaxy. Jake had spent his life fixing things that were broken. Now he would have to fix something much bigger. As he stood in the belly of the war submarine, the weight of what he was about to do settled on his shoulders. He was about to declare war. alone against the most advanced alien race in the galaxy, but they had made one critical mistake. They underestimated him. Jake climbed back into the cockpit, his hands shaking slightly as he strapped himself into the seat. He stared at the control panels in front of him, his mind racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. The Trill could detect him before he even left the workshop. The submarine systems might fail mid-mission. He could die before he even got the chance to fight back. But then he thought about the way the Trill had laughed at him, the way they had mocked humanity's last remnants, treating them like they were nothing more than pests to be crushed. His anger flared again, burning away the doubt. He reached for the controls, activating the Leviathan's engines, the workshop filled with the low hum of power as the war submarine lifted off the ground, its thrusters glowing faintly as it hovered above the floor. Jake grinned. It was time. With a flick of a switch, the Leviathan engaged its cloaking device, disappearing from sight as it glided silently through the workshop doors and out into the frigid Titan night. The methane seas stretched out before him, dark and forbidding, but Jake felt a surge of exhilaration as the submarine sensors scanned the horizon. He was going to make the Trill pay for every moment of humiliation, for every life they had taken, and he would do it in the one thing they never saw coming: an ancient human war machine that was now more dangerous than ever. The Leviathan surged forward, slipping beneath the waves of Titan's methane oceans, its sleek form disappearing into the depths. Jake's fingers danced across the controls, the submarine responding to his every command. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and now it was time to test whether human ingenuity could still stand against the might of the Trill deep below the surface, where the alien rulers would never expect an attack. Jake whispered to himself, "Let's show them what humans can do." The methane sea was eerily calm, its surface smooth and reflective under the pale orange light of Titan's distant sun. But beneath the waves, deep in the frigid depths, the Leviathan sliced through the liquid like a silent predator. Jake Harrow sat in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls as the submarine glided through the methane ocean murky waters. The Leviathan sensors flickered, displaying the vast alien landscape on his screen: rocky underwater ridges, deep trenches, and patches of bioluminescent vegetation that thrived in Titan extreme conditions. For hours, Jake had navigated the submerged environment undetected. The Trilly's underwater patrols had become routine, their soldiers too arrogant to believe that anyone would dare challenge their rule, especially in the methane oceans that only their sophisticated ships dared traverse. That arrogance would be their downfall. Jake's fingers tapped the control panel, bringing up a tactical map on the screen. The Trilly's fleet, a dozen sleek organic ships, had been detected by the Leviathan sensors as they descended into the methane sea for their routine military exercises. Each ship moved with an eerie grace, their organic structures pulsing with faint bioluminescent light. They were a terrifying blend of biology and technology, shaped more and more like living creatures than machines. Jake had no doubt that they were fast, agile, and deadly, but they weren't invincible. Not against what he had planned. The submarine's cloaking device kept it invisible to the TRS advanced sensors, and Jake used that advantage to stay out of sight. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rebuilding the Leviathan, studying Trill patrol patterns, and figuring out the weaknesses in their ships. Now everything was coming together. The Leviathan was armed, powered, and ready for war. His heart pounded in his chest as the alien fleet came into view. On the main display screen, the submarine's periscope feeding him a clear picture of the enemy vessels. The largest ship, a command cruiser, hovered at the center of the formation, surrounded by a smaller escort of scout ships and frigs. Jake had no idea how many soldiers were on board, but it didn't matter. He wasn't planning on engaging them in a drawn-out battle. He was going to strike fast, strike hard, and vanish before they even knew what hit them. Jake reached over to the weapons control panel, his fingers hovering over the plasma torpedo system. The Leviathan targeting computer locked onto the command cruiser, calculating the Firing solution, the tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment Jake hesitated. He had never done this before. Sure, he trained on simulators, studied the military manuals, but this was real. This was the moment when he would go from being just a mechanic to something else entirely, a resistance fighter, an insurgent, maybe even a hero. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the targeting display. "Come on, Jake," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his nerves. "You've got this." With a deep breath, he flicked the safety off the plasma torpedo system. The hum of power surged through the submarine as the weapon systems came online, the torpedo tubes pressurizing and ready to launch. The Leviathan's targeting computer adjusted the solution, compensating for the water density and distance to the target. Jake's heart raced, but his focus sharpened. There was no turning back now. With a quick press of a button, the first torpedo fired. A muffled thud reverberated through the Leviathan as the torpedo launched from its tube, streaking through the dark waters toward the command cruiser. The plasma torpedo was a marvel of Earth's military engineering, a weapon designed to bypass shields and armor, delivering a devastating payload of energy directly into its target. Jake watched as the torpedo closed in on the cruiser, the seconds ticking by like an eternity. Then, in an instant, the torpedo struck. A massive explosion ripped through the methane sea, sending shock waves through the water. The command cruiser shuddered violently, its biolumin lights flickering as the torpedo's plasma payload tore into its hull. A plume of bubbles and debris shot up from the impact site, obscuring the cruiser from view. Jake sensors screamed with activity as the Trill fleet scrambled in confusion. "Direct hit," Jake whispered, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. The Trill fleet reacted immediately, their ships moving in frantic patterns as they tried to figure out what had just happened. They couldn't see him, not with the Leviathan's cloaking device still active. Jake took advantage of their confusion, locking onto the second target, a nearby frigate, and fired another torpedo. This time the response was faster. The frigate tried to maneuver out of the way, but the plasma torpedo was too fast. It slammed into the side of the ship, detonating with the same devastating force. Another explosion rocked the sea, and Jake could see pieces of the frig's organic structure tearing away as it began to sink into the depths. The Trill fleet was now in complete disarray. They fired blindly into the water, their energy weapons sending beams of light cutting through the dark sea, but they had no idea where the attack was coming from. The Leviathans slipped between their ships undetected like a shark among fish. Jake's confidence grew with each strike. He fired a third torpedo, this time targeting one of the scout ships that had broken formation and was moving toward the surface. The torpedo hit its mark, and the scout ship disintegrated in a violent flash of energy. The Trill were panicking now, their communication channels intercepted by the Leviathan. Sensors were filled with frantic orders and desperate attempts to coordinate, but Jake wasn't going to give them the chance. He pushed the submarine's thrusters to full power, accelerating toward the command cruiser. His plan was simple: finish what he had started. The cruiser was still reeling from the initial strike, its systems damaged and its shields flickering as they tried to come back online. Jake lined up the final shot, his eyes focused on the tactical display. One more torpedo would be enough to the cruiser, completely leaving it helpless on the ocean floor. But just as he was about to fire, something unexpected happened. The cruiser's hull began to pulse with light, an eerie bioluminescent glow that rippled across its surface. Jake's sensors picked up a surge of energy coming from the ship's core, and a moment later a massive shock wave burst from the cruiser, rippling through the water like a tsunami. The Leviathan system screamed in warning as the shock wave slammed into the submarine, sending it tumbling backward through the sea. Jake gritted his teeth, fighting to regain control of the vessel as alarms blared around him. The shock wave had disrupted his cloak device, momentarily revealing the submarine's position to the Trill. He had seconds to react before they pinpointed him. "Damn it," Jake muttered as he slammed his hand down on the controls, forcing the Leviathan into a sharp dive. The Submarine plunged deeper into the methane sea, its thrusters straining to outrun the Trill. Sensor scans. His tactical display flickered as the Trill ships began closing in their weapons, charging and locking on to his position. They had finally spotted him. Jake's heart pounded as he pushed the submarine to its limits, diving into the dark abyss of Titan's ocean. The enemy ships followed their beams of energy, lighting up the water around him. The Leviathan dodged and weaved, narrowly avoiding the incoming fire, but the Trill were relentless. He had to think fast. The cruiser was still damaged, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. If he didn't act now, they would repair their systems, and the element of surprise would be gone. Jake quickly scanned the tactical map, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. There, an underwater trench, deep and narrow, just a few kilometers away. Jake didn't hesitate. He punched in the coordinates and redirected the Leviathan toward the trench, its engines roaring as the submarine shot forward. The Trill ships followed, their weapons still firing, but Jake knew they wouldn't be able to match his maneuverability in the tight confines of the trench. As the Leviathan dove into the narrow passage, the Trill ships hesitated, unwilling to risk getting trapped. Jake used that moment of hesitation to his advantage. He brought the submarine to a stop and activated the remaining torpedo leton. "End this," he muttered, locking onto the cruiser one final time. The plasma torpedo launched, streaking through the water toward the damaged command ship. The Trill didn't see it coming until it was too late. The torpedo struck the cruiser's reactor core, and for a brief moment the sea was illuminated with a brilliant flash of light. The explosion was massive, far larger than Jake had anticipated. The shock wave tore through the ocean, sending debris and wreckage spiraling into the depths. The Trill fleet was obliterated in an instant, their ships consumed by the blast. Jake sat back in his seat, breathing heavily as the Leviathan drifted in the aftermath of the battle. The Trill were gone. He had done it. A mechanic had just taken down the most advanced alien fleet in the solar system. Jake couldn't help but smile, but deep down he knew this was only the beginning. The aftermath of the battle had left Titan seas eerily silent. Jake Harrow sat in the cockpit of the Leviathan, breathing heavily as the adrenaline of the fight began to fade. The Trill fleet had been annihilated, their command cruiser a smoldering wreck, sinking into the methane abyss. The once invincible alien force which had lorded over humanity for years was gone, at least for now. But Jake knew the Trill wouldn't take this defeat quietly. The victory wasn't just his, it was a message to every human still struggling under alien rule. It was proof that the Trill could be beaten. As the Leviathan rose from the depths, breaching the surface of Titan's methane sea, Jake could see the human colony in the distance, nestled beneath the dome that protected it from Titan's toxic atmosphere. The colony was little more than a shanty town now, its people beaten down, forced to work for the Trill in exchange for meager rations and the beast's survival. For the first time in years, Jake felt something stirring inside him. He had spent so long fixing broken machines and patching up old tech that he had forgotten what it felt like to have hoped. Now, as the Leviathan cut through the methane waves toward the colony, he felt something else: purpose. His victory over the Trill fleet had given him more than just satisfaction. It had given him a chance to strike back, to inspire others to rise against their alien oppressors. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. He would need allies, people willing to fight, willing to risk everything. As the Leviathan approached the colony's docks, Jake powered down the submarine's engines and engaged the cloaking device. Once again, the Trill would be scrambling to understand what had happened to their fleet, and they wouldn't waste time sending reinforcements. He couldn't afford to be discovered just yet. He needed to move quickly. Jake disembarked from the submarine, leaving it hidden in the depths just offshore, and made his way into the colony under the cover of night. The streets were quiet, the human workers exhausted from their long shifts in the Trill factories. Few noticed Jake as he slipped through the narrow alleys and back roads, making his way to a familiar place, an old tavern near the colony's outskirts, where the last remnants of humanity's resistance had Once gathered when Jake pushed open the door, he was greeted by the faint smell of stale beer and the low murmur of voices inside. The tavern was dimly lit. Its patrons huddled around small tables, talking in hushed tones. Most of them were miners and laborers, men and women, who had given up any hope of rebellion. Years ago, they barely glanced at Jake as he walked in, but there was one man who did. Sitting in the back of the room, nursing a drink, was Marcus Deo, former Earth Navy officer and one of the last leaders of the human resistance on Titan. His hair was graying and his face was lined with the weariness of too many battles fought and too many lost, but his eyes were sharp as they met Jake's. "What are you doing here, Hero?" Marcus asked, his voice low but commanding. "I thought you gave up on this war a long time ago." Jake pulled up a chair and sat across from Marcus, his heart still racing from the battle. "I didn't give up, I just didn't see a way to fight back." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And now you do?" Jake leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "I just destroyed a Trill fleet." The room seemed to go silent for a moment, as if the very air had been sucked out. Marcus stared at Jake, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, a skeptical look crossing his face. "You're serious?" Jake nodded. "Dead serious. The Trillies command cruiser, their escort ships all gone. The Leviathan did it." Marcus frowned. "The Leviathan, that old war submarine you've been working on for years? You're telling me you used that thing to take down an entire fleet?" Jake's eyes burned with determination. "Yes, I've been restoring it for years, and tonight I made my move." "The Trill never saw it coming." Marcus was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working through what Jake had just told him. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "If what you're saying is true, then this changes everything. But you know what happens next, right?" Jake nodded. "The Trill will retaliate. They'll send more. They'll come down on us hard." Marcus's expression darkened. "Exactly. They'll burn this colony to the ground just to make an example of us." Jake's fists clenched. "Then we fight? We can't keep living like this, Marcus. The Trill think they've already broken us, but tonight proved they're not invincible. We have the Leviathan. We have a chance." "For a moment," Marcus said nothing. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes distant. Then, without warning, he slammed the glass down on the table hard enough to make the room jump. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice suddenly filled with a fire that hadn't been there before. "We do have a chance, but we need more than just one submarine. We need people, fighters, and we need to hit them hard before they can hit us." Jake leaned forward. "I've been thinking about that. There are still old military stockpiles hidden around on Titan, weapons and tech that the Trill haven't found. We could arm the colony, get people ready for a real fight." Marcus smiled, a grim, determined smile. "It's about time. I've been waiting for someone to wake up." The two men spent the next few hours huddled over a map of Titan, discussing their plan. Marcus knew people like soldiers, miners, and laborers who had once fought in the resistance and were still willing to take up arms. Jake would provide the hidden weapon that would strike fear into the Trill. Together they would turn the colony into a fortress ready to fight back when the Trill came by dawn. They had a plan. Words spread quickly through the colony, whispered from ear to ear, passed in secret from worker to worker. The Trill, still reeling from the loss of their fleet, had no idea what was happening beneath the surface. Jake had inspired something that hadn't been seen in years, a spark of rebellion, and soon it became more than a spark. It became a wildfire as Jake prepared the Leviathan. As the fight continued, more and more humans joined the cause. The old resistance network came back to life. Hidden weapons were found, and the people of Titan, who had been oppressed for so long, began to rise up. The Trill had better technology, but the humans had nothing left to lose. Within days, the first battles began. Trill patrols were ambushed in the methane seas, their ships destroyed by quick strikes from the Leviathan. Sabotage missions weakened the Trill's supply lines, and humans started to take back control of the colony. With each victory, the rebellion gained strength, but Jake knew the real challenge was still ahead. Soon, the Trill responded with a massive warship, even bigger than the one Jake had destroyed before. It hovered over Titan, ready to attack, surrounded by smaller ships. The colony prepared for the assault, but Jake was ready too. He had armed the Leviathan with every weapon he could find and every trick he had learned. This time, he wasn't fighting alone. As the Trill warship aimed to destroy the humans below, Jake acted first. The Leviathan shot out of the methane sea, firing plasma torpedoes that hit the warship hard, causing explosions. For the first time, the Trill felt fear. The battle was intense. The Trill had more ships, but the humans fought with renewed determination. The Leviathan was the key. Using its cloaking device, Jake attacked from the shadows, taking out the Trill ships one by one. The humans, now armed and organized, fought back fiercely, and slowly but surely, they started to push the Trill back. By the end of the battle, the Trill warship was destroyed, and the skies above Titan were clear. Jake stood on the docks, watching the wreckage burn in the distance. The colony had been damaged, but it had survived. For the first time in years, the humans were free. The Leviathan had become a legend, a symbol of resistance, and Jake Harrow, once mocked by aliens, had led the fight that brought the Trill to their knees. The war wasn't over, but it had changed forever. As the people of Titan celebrated, Jake knew the Trill would return, but now humanity had hope. They had the Leviathan, and they had Jake, the mechanic who had become their greatest weapon. No one would laugh at human technology again.